Let's talk about the actual system which lubricates a reciprocating engine. So, as you would know, lubricant, oil-based lubricants, help protect most equipment components. So ensuring that there's adequate flow around the system is extremely important. Now, what kind of components from within the engine actually require lubrication? It's pretty much anything that moves. So if we start from the top, we've got the actual cam shaft. Now, it's not necessarily the shaft itself that needs to be lubricated, but the bearings certainly need to be lubricated, right? So they're usually journal bearings and would experience hydrodynamic lubrication. Then we've got the cam lobes, which are often under extremely high load. So it is the sliding and rotational motion between the cam lobe and the cam follower, which is a particular area of concern, especially in highly loaded engines like a race engine or a drag race engine or something like that. The valve guides. Now, this is a bit of a trick one. So we've got the valve guides as well as the valve stem. These do need to be lubricated because there is relative motion between the two of them. However, they aren't lubricated by the engine oil. So the valve guide and the valve stem tend to be self-lubricated, generally from the material that they're made from. Then we have the cylinder liner. So there is relative motion between the cylinder liner and the actual piston itself. And then you've got the piston rings, which kind of scrape their way across the cylinder liner. And we're trying to protect the motion between the two of those. Then you've obviously got the piston skirt as well, the piston pin and the bearing that is associated with the piston pin. Then you've got the big end bearing and the crankshaft main bearing, as well as the timing chain in the gear, the oil pump, as well as the turbo, if there is one. So all of these components on an engine need to be lubricated. So if we were to take a look at an animation of an engine, you can see that there are a lot of moving parts. Some of it is going to be sliding, right? So there's the motion up and down of the pistons, but most of it is rotational motion. And it's really important that we get lubricant to all of these different points. Now remember, there is a single engine oil which is lubricating all these components. So it's not like we have dedicated products which are dedicated towards crankshaft lubrication, gear lubrication, timing chain lubrication. They're all lubricated by the same system. And so it needs to be very reliable as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the flow of oil through an engine. What we have here is an animation where basically we're showing the flow of oil through the system, and I'll try and highlight the individual components. So down the bottom, we have the oil pan or the oil sump. So this is really the oil reservoir, if you like. We would call it an oil reservoir in any other application, but with engines, we usually call it the oil sump. So this is obviously at the low point because everything is going to drain down into the oil pan. Now, the fluid level in the oil pan is going to be extremely important because the next part is that oil has to be drawn through a strainer. Now, a strainer, I guess you could technically call it a filter, but it's really more like a mesh filter. So it's not kind of, it's certainly not any kind of depth media filtration. It's not like the oil filter, which is further downstream. It's just a strainer to ensure that large pieces of debris or wear metals don't get sucked back into the oil system. From there, right, it gets pulled up from the oil pan into the actual oil pump. Now, the oil pump is interesting. So if you look at this, one thing that you'll notice is that the oil pump is generally just a basic geared pump. So it's a positive displacement pump, and it is driven by the motion of the engine. So if the engine is off, there is no pump pressure, right? So that's one crucial thing to understand about engine startups. It's not like, we don't prime the pumps or anything like that. We don't try and pump lubricant around the system before we get the engine started. It starts when the engine starts. Okay, from there, we're pumping into an oil filter. So this is obviously really important. Clean oil is very important, and we always preach here the importance of clean oil. Oil filters in engines are really designed to remove, contaminants as well as wear metals, right? We don't want them circulating around the system all the time. That's also going to prolong the life of the oil as well as the life of the components in the engine. From the oil filter, it gets pumped under pressure into the main oil gallery. And this is what really supplies sort of the sump area, which is the crankshaft and the big end bearings, right? So all of those are lubricated from the main oil gallery. And depending on the type of cam arrangement that you have, sometimes that oil will then get pumped up into a secondary oil gallery where we can then lubricate the cams and sort of the top end of the engine. Now, this is where I've described everything that is kind of forced lubrication. So this is lubrication under pressure. All the other components are more or less splash lubricated. So, we are getting lubricant, for example, that is forced into the camshaft bearings, but the actual cam lobes and cam followers, there is no sort of like direct spray of lubricant onto those locations. Similarly with the cylinders and the pistons, in some engines you do have a spray that sprays the underside of the piston, but for the most part they are generally splash lubricated. And so the simple motion and the churn of the crankshaft and the big end is going to splash enough lubricant that it gets up into the cylinders and is able to lubricate them as well as the pistons. So this is all of the major components to an engine oil system.